center. If you need to see it better, I encourage you also to move to the center. Okay. Boy, that was a great reading from the gospel. I'm kind of bummed I'm not preaching on it today. But we've got other work to do. And this today is the second part of my, hold on, let's see here. I'm good. I'm going to start recording, that's it. It is being recorded. Is it being recorded? Yes. Okay, thank you. I'm going to start share something. Start share. Hold on. I thought I had this already. Hold on. Okay. Let me start share. Okay, let me go in here. Oh, here we go. Also, you can see this black screen. So today is the second iteration of the Instructed Eucharist we planned for Lent. This is all to prepare for us to retire the little cups. Can you, yes. Ask them if they can see my screen. Okay, I think so. So if they can see a black screen, that would be great. Yeah? Okay. Prepare us to retire the little cups because the bishop has asked us to do this to be a part of the wider practices of the Episcopal Church and especially our diocese. So because we are Episcopalian, we will comply because the bishop is a representation of our unity, and unless there's something really bad that's being asked for, we do it, right? That's a good reason. But Barbara last week told us about other reasons for going back to the common cup. So one of the biggest reasons that she talked about last week was that the early church practiced the use of a common cup, and this was scandalous because back in the day, hierarchy was very clear what class you were, and you did not share a cup with people who were beneath you. So when the early Christians shared a common cup, it collapsed those hierarchies and made us one in Christ. And so that's a very powerful symbol. Today I want to pull back from one of the signs of the Eucharist, which is the cup, to 3 signs that I want to focus on today. Okay? I want to talk about the primary signs of communion. So we'll first, though, talk about that by starting from the ground up to this thing that moves from a historical event called the Last Supper to this thing that we call the Eucharist, which becomes something bigger than just a historical event. And you will see that I call it a portal of grace. And we'll talk more about that. So the Last Supper, as a historical event, what is the most famous painting, image you can think of? Right? Let's set the table here. Okay, you've got, I need to minimize this here. Sorry, I didn't realize it was here. Okay, so this is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. You see that. So the story goes that when Da Vinci first painted this painting, he had this big, fancy chalice in the middle, encrusted with jewels, just like what he would experience in his medieval church, right? So he's painting this, and then he asked somebody to come and look at his painting, and he's like, what do you notice first? And the guy's like, oh, that chalice, all those rubies and lapis lazuli, yeah, I love that chalice. And he's like, oh, okay. And he got his paintbrush and brushed it out, okay? because it was not the primary thing in the painting he wanted people to see. So he instead put these little see-through glass cups all around, and so that then, because they're transparent and see-through and not the focal point, the tableau, the meaning of the tableau gets lifted up, right? And this is the moment where Jesus says, one of you will betray me. And everyone's like, no, not me, right? And then they're like, maybe him, maybe him. So Da Vinci edits his painting to highlight the primary nature of his intention. And we will talk about what it means to highlight the primary signs of the Holy Eucharist. But we'll build that from the ground up. Because you see that the painting has individual plates and cups. What was it really like at the Last Supper? So late antiquity and the Renaissance didn't really care about historical accuracy. Partly because they haven't really done a lot of studies. There wasn't a very good body of literature that's coming out of archaeology. But by the late 1800s, archaeology was in full swing, right? Because people were digging and digging and digging. But mostly they were digging in wealthy places, like palaces, elite homes. And they saw that in Judea, those homes were usually set with a table called a triclinium, a three-sided table, and it's a hierarchical seating chart. And so they decided, well, maybe it's historically more accurate if we put the Last Supper in a triclinium setting. But that's not actually right, because that is for this kind of feast, yeah? There's a triclinium setting here with, and it's all men, right? It's a single sex. The wealthy, a lot of cushions, a lot of grapes and garlands and beautiful gardens outside, and here are the slaves carrying a banquet, and they're parading it around, and once they finish serving, they will, the dancers will come in, and the bards will come in, and the musicians will come in. And all the tables, they each have their own individual setting, individual cups. But these settings were only in elite homes, Roman homes, and like King Herod. King Herod's palace had tricliniums. So Herodotus, who comes in to dance and asking for St. John the Baptist's head, right? Probably took one of these platters that was on this side and decided to put his head on it, right? So that is early archaeology. More recent archaeology has found that in most average homes, they didn't really have a separate dining room. They would have one room, and when it was time to have a meal, they would push whatever's aside. There wasn't much furniture. And they would spread out a reed mat or palm fronds, and they would sit on the floor in a circle and eat from a common casserole dish. So this is much more likely what the Last Supper would have looked like. A common central hummus plate. When I was doing this, I kept wanting to get hummus. I'm gonna get some after for lunch. And you'll have it for agape meal on a Maundy Thursday. They used the bread as spoons. They would sit on the floor. And this dining was called common dining. And 99% of the homes of ordinary people had this kind of setup. No individual setting, a communal casserole. So it's quite a jump, right, from the fancy thing to this humble thing. And this is kind of how they prepared the meal. The women would bake the bread in a clay oven like this. And then they served the wine, the liquids, from a wine pitcher, and then they would pour it into a pottery cup. So the Last Supper probably had this kind of humble pottery cup. And they didn't have individual settings, so all of the meal would have been communal, and the cup would have been passed around for drinks. So that's what it probably looked like. So this is what it looks like today, right? Yeah, a little familiar, right? Yeah? But you know, even though it's very different looking, there's a lot of difference, there's still some things in here that are essentially the same. And that is the bread and the cup. Those are still essential things. And there is this push-pull in church practice always to kind of pull away from the essential to like make things more ornate. And that got a little crazy during the medieval time, right? It got so ornate, they lost the essential bread and cup to the point where people weren't even taking communion, right? Very rarely. So in the liturgical movement of the 1970s, there was a push out of scholarship and study and theology to pull back to the center of the cup and the wine. But with just the cup and the wine, you don't have a sacrament. You don't have a sacrament. You need something very important. You need the words of institution. So this is the context of the meal, right? Jesus is sitting on the floor with his disciples. They're kind of near the end of their meal. This is the day before he's going to be crucified. It's Maundy Thursday, and he has something to say to them. But he does it with what we call signs. Something that will have more to it than what they see. So he, in the midst of the meal, picks up bread, and they're like, oh, okay, bread, you know, we've been eating this, right? But he does something that makes the bread become a sign. He takes it, he breaks it, he passes it around, and he says, this is my body. Eat it. Okay. And then he takes the cup they've been drinking out of, and he says, this is my blood. Pass it around. Share it. Drink my blood. If you were a good Jew, which they all were, they would have been like, what did he say? Did he say, drink my blood? Okay. So we hear these words all the time, and they just kind of pass by us because, you know, we hear it all the time. But let's see if we can go back to that first moment they could have heard it. And I'm taking this saying, this quote from the Gospel of John, which famously does not have an institution of the Eucharist, but has this big discourse called the Bread of Life discourse. And this is where he makes it a little more scandalous. Right? He says, he who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. We've moved from bread to flesh. We've moved from body to flesh. It's getting very bloody, very fleshy. And the people who hear him talk about this, they're like, this is a difficult teaching. Ew, yuck. No, we can't accept this. And so after this discourse in the Gospel of John, many disciples, so not the 12, many disciples left. They left. They're like, no, we were good with the other stuff, but now you're taking it up to the totally gross level, and we don't want it. yuck. Why? Why were they so appalled by this? They were appalled by this because, let me move this thing out of the way, because the blood was very much a part of the cultic activity, the moral and spiritual limits of animal sacrifice and consumption of meat. So as you recall, after Noah, God said, okay, you can eat meat, but not with the blood in it, because the blood is the life of the animal. No blood. So you got to drain all your meat of blood. And then in sacrifices, the priests were told, right? And everyone's told, do not eat the blood, for the life of every creature is in its blood. The life belongs to God. And that's why that blood is sprinkled. It's only used for animal sacrifice in the temple. And it's used for sprinkling on the altar. The blood belongs to God and is given back to God by the sprinkling on the altar. No one can eat the blood. And it was such an intense prohibition that even in Acts, this is a time when the Gentiles are joining the community. They had this massive debate when the Gentiles started joining the Jews in community. Paul goes there to Jerusalem and talks with the apostles, and the apostles are, and Paul's like, I got great news, the Gentiles are coming and following Jesus. And they're like, well, we're Jews and they're Gentiles, and one of our biggest mark of difference and religious purity was circumcision. And they actually decided, you know what, we won't require that. We won't require circumcision. That was huge. And then like, well, you know what, we won't even make it a burden to them to require them to eat kosher. These are all marks of being a Jew, right? And being religious and being a follower of Yahweh. But the one thing they said was, they must abstain from blood. So they made all these flexible things within the new path, except no blood. So, what is Jesus doing when he takes the bread and says, my body? When he takes the cup and says, my blood? I mean, it is of no shock that those people outside of Christianity, when they first started watching Christians celebrate communion, said they're cannibals. So what is Jesus doing? For a while there was a debate among theologians and historians. The central thing within Judaism, and Jesus is saying something completely just mind-blowing, scandalous. Some asked, did he really say that? Would a good Jew really say that? And so I actually really wrestled with this question myself. I read a lot, and I finally went to my New Testament professor, Bill Countryman, at CDSP, and I said, and he was like on his way to chapel, so I'm like, I just have one question for you before you go into chapel to do all your stuff. He's like, what? I'm like, did Jesus really say that? And then he's like, I don't know who else would say that. And I'm like, I don't know who else would say that. And that started me on a journey of wondering, what does he mean by it when he says it? So now I believe he said it, but what does he mean? Because it's not it can't be like, this whole thing is so disconnected for me. So this is where I bring in a scholar named Anthony Bartlett, who has really helped me to think about what Jesus means when he says, eat my flesh, drink my blood. And his general premise is around animal sacrifice and the violence of the temple sacrificial system, and how Jesus, with what he says, inverts, reverses the violent system through his own death and resurrection on the cross. So we'll take this kind of step by step here. So, as you know, this whole story of the Last Supper happens in the context of Holy Week, right? Jesus marches into Jerusalem on a donkey, and he goes into the temple. The first compound is the Gentile compound, like the mixed compound. Anyone can go in there. And there's where the money changers are. And someone asked me why there were money changers. And so the temple system had a lot of purity codes, right? And people were carrying around Roman money. And you heard today from the Decalogue, thou shalt not make for thyself any graven image. Well, the coins that they carry all had a graven image of the emperor, right? You can't carry that into the temple. If you want to buy an animal for a sacrifice, you got to go to the money changer and exchange it for a shekel, which doesn't have an image. That becomes pure money, temple money. So the money changers are there sitting at their tables, helping people exchange their darius or whatever into a shekel. And Jesus goes into that area and he flips over the tables of the money changers and opens the gates and releases the animals. Historically, this has been said to be about Jesus condemning the profiteering that was going on. But Anthony Bartlett says that actually it wasn't about the money, about being greedy. Jesus was making it impossible for people to buy animals for sacrifice. He was trying to stop the blood sacrifice. And as if to declare a very different concept of God. My God, Jesus God, says, no more of this. No more sacrifices, because I am a God who does not need death and the killing of a thing to offer its life. And Jesus says, I am here to dismantle the system of sacrifices, to move away from blood sacrifice. And so when he then on Maundy Thursday talks about the blood and the flesh, it is here that he's saying, I'm emptying these symbols that have been so prohibited of their violence. And I will show you how I will do it. But you know, when he's doing this, he is challenging centuries of cultic practice and a whole system of power and religion. No wonder they wanted to kill him. And so when he then on Maundy Thursday offers up a sign of inverted violence, what he does is he completes that on the cross on Friday. And more than what you think, right? There was at the temple. This now is the whole wide stage of the empire. So he begins his inversion of violence at the temple. But that violence isn't just at the temple. It's all over. It's from the foundations of the world. And there he inverts it. And in this crucifixion, he can look upon everyone and says, you're all awful. And God's going to come and destroy you. But he doesn't say that. On the cross, he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Completely unexpected. I mean, like someone cuts me off and, the wrath of God, I'm just like, and like, he's being crucified and he says, Father, forgive. And so what began at the temple, what the signs were then made worldwide on the cross. And this is his pronouncement, a completely forgiving, loving, peaceful response to violence. And it's captured completely or rounded out at the resurrection appearance. When you rise from the dead, people would be impressed, right? And they're like, oh yeah, here's the guy with all the power. Not even death can destroy him. And instead of coming back and gathering an army to wreak vengeance on those who hurt him and killed him, and instead of coming back to the disciples and said, you betrayed me, you cowards, he doesn't say that. What does he say? Peace be with you. Peace be with you. And he offers actually another sign, another portal within his wound. Enter my peace. So the Holy Eucharist is given to us as a perpetual sign, as something we do after the resurrection, after the ascension, as we await the second coming, as this means by which we enter into this way of becoming a new creation by walking through this portal of grace that is emptied out of its violence. The bread, the wine, and the offering, this is my body, this is my blood. And so, Anthony Bartlett says, oh, by the way, I just wanted to be kind of pretty clear that what I'm offering you here today is not out there. Like, most of what we grew up with was substitutionary theory, right? Jesus had to die because we were sinful, right? Or what else did people grow up with? Oh, or like, this is not a debate about metaphysics, right? This is not like, did the blood, is this transubstantiation or what, right? This is not that. This is a third way of understanding the Eucharist as a theater in which we are seeing the end of sacred violence, which is animal sacrifice, which these signs are given to us so that we are invited to take in the bread and the wine, so that we, in that act, surrender to the nonviolent love on the other side of the portal. And so when we say yes, we fall and fall and fall into an ocean of love. And with that love, we become a new creation. So, that's a lot. I just walked you through Holy Week. But this is the distillation. The bread, the cup of wine, and the words of institution. This is my blood. This is my body. Come and take. It's for you. Amen.
Amen.